When they were cast out, no one looked back at them. The people in the homeland closed their gates and returned to their lives as if nothing important had happened. It was as if the entire group had suddenly become invisible. They were told they were the cause of problems, that they created disorder, that the city would be better without them. Deep down, many of them knew these were lies, but lies spoken again and again start to feel like truth to those who want someone else to blame. And so, with a few bags, exhausted hearts, and no idea of what lay ahead, they walked away from the Yaste, place they once called home. The group moved slowly at first. Some carried the very old. Some held the hands of the very young. Others simply stared straight ahead, as if looking back might make the pain worse. No one spoke for a long time. Silence felt safer than words. Every sound the crunch of gravel under their feet, the wind brushing against. Dry grass felt louder than usual. At the center of the group walked one person who kept observing everything. He wasn't a leader, at least not officially, but people often looked at him when they felt uncertain. He didn't speak much, but he listened, he noticed, and he carried a small notebook where he wrote down things they experienced. He believed that someday someone should know the truth of what happened. Even if their story was forgotten by the world, he didn't want it to disappear from memory. They walked far enough that the homeland became a small blur behind them. Some people still whispered questions. Why were they blamed? Why didn't anyone defend them? Could things have ended differently? No one had answers. Only tired steps and the distant promise of land none of them had ever seen before. As night fell, they stopped in an open field. They had no tents, so they slept under the sky. A cold breeze made many shiver. The older ones tried to comfort the younger ones, telling them that the sky had always been their shelter, long before walls and cities existed. But these words could not hide the truth. They had nowhere to go. The next morning, they started walking again. Hunger began to trouble them. Water was running low. Their legs felt heavier. Some members stumbled, but the others helped them up. Even in their misery, they stayed together. That was one thing the homeland never understood about them. They were not a problem. They were a community. The land slowly changed as they moved forward. Grass gave way to dry soil. Trees became fewer. The sky looked bigger, almost too big, stretching endlessly without offering comfort. It felt like the world was swallowing them into a place no one else wanted. Days passed like this. Dust on their clothes, heat burning their skin in the day, cold biting them at night. People began to question whether leaving was better than staying in a place that hated them. Yet even those doubts couldn't erase the truth. They were no longer welcome there. One afternoon, after walking through a long stretch of cracked earth, the group came across a ridge. The land dropped forward in a wide, broken landscape. It wasn't beautiful or welcoming. It looked harsh, but empty. Empty could mean danger, but it could also mean freedom. They stood silently, staring at it. No walls, no gates, no voices telling them they didn't belong. Just land untouched, unclaimed, uninviting, but theirs if they had the courage to move forward. But before they climbed down into the broken valley ahead, the group rested on the ridge. They were tired, mentally and physically. Some cried quietly. Others stared into the distance, as if trying to imagine life beyond this moment. The one with the notebook sat under a small rock formation to shade himself and wrote every detail he could. He wrote about how they walked without knowing where they were going, how fear held their hearts, and yet how none of them turned against each other. Even in the hardest moments, they chose unity. Food continued to run low. They shared tiny portions, making sure the youngest and oldest ate first. Some days, the adults went hungry so the children didn't have to. That was their way. They protected each other, even when they had nothing. The homeland had accused them of being selfish, But the truth was the opposite. Out here, far from the lies and judgments, their real nature appeared clearer than ever. 1. Night, a strong windstorm swept through the open land. They had no shelters, so they pressed together, covering the children with whatever cloth they had left. Dust filled the air. The wind screamed across the barren ground. Some felt fear rising in their chest, but they held on to each other. When the storm finally passed, they were covered in dust and shaking, but still together. The notebook tied tightly with a string remained safe in the writer's hands. As the days grew darker and the challenges heavier, doubts started creeping into their minds. Some wondered if they should return and beg for forgiveness, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. Others argued that going back would only bring more pain. These conversations were quiet, almost whispered, because no one wanted to break the fragile hope holding them together. But hope is strange. It appears in unexpected moments. One morning, after a long night of freezing cold, the sun rose with a soft warmth they had not felt in many days. The sky was calm. The wind carried a faint scent of plants. Not many, but enough to hint that there might be life nearby. They followed the scent, pushing through uneven land and rocks until they reached the edge of a narrow path leading downward. They stepped carefully, helping one another over loose stones. The path twisted and turned till it opened to a wide valley hidden between tall rocky walls. The valley wasn't beautiful in a traditional sense. It looked tired, covered in dry plants and broken soil. But among the cracks, some patches of green shone faintly. There was a sound, too, a quiet trickling, like water moving. For the first time in days, their hearts lifted. Water meant survival. Water meant a chance, even a small one. They searched the valley and found a thin stream hidden behind stones. It wasn't much, but it was clean and cool, and that alone felt like a miracle. They drank carefully, making sure everyone had turns. Some smiled for the first time since leaving their homeland. Others cried silently out of relief that it wasn't a paradise. The valley was rough, broken, and forgotten, much like them. But because of that, it felt like a place where they could start again. No one had claimed it. No one would push them out. No one would judge them. It was a blank page in a world that had written them off. The one with the notebook wrote again that day, describing the valley as a wounded place injured by time, but still alive. He wrote that maybe they were the same. Maybe they needed a place like this, a land with scars, because they carried their own. That night, they slept near the small stream. The ground was hard, the air still cold, but their hearts felt lighter. They talked a little, the way people talk when they begin to hope, but are afraid to trust it too quickly. Some wondered what they would do next. Others suggested finding wood, building shelters, exploring deeper into the valley. The idea of building something new felt strange, but also exciting. For the first time since being cast out, they weren't only thinking about surviving. They were imagining a future as they drifted into sleep. The sounds of running water filled the air. It was soft, steady, almost comforting. The valley might have been forgotten by the world, but to them, it felt like a quiet promise. A promise that maybe their story wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning. And in that quiet place, far from the gates that shut them out, a tiny spark of new life began to grow inside each of them. They didn't know what the next day would bring, but for now they had water, shelter from judgment, and each other. That alone was enough to keep moving forward. The valley gave them hope, but hope did not erase hunger. The first few days were quiet, as if everyone was trying to understand whether this place was truly safe or just another temporary stop. The land looked peaceful, but it was also clear that it would not give anything easily. The soil was dry in most parts, and the plants around them were thin and weak. Still, compared to the empty wasteland they had crossed. This was a blessing. Every morning they woke up early because the cold. Nights didn't allow much sleep. The group sat near the stream, washing their faces, sharing whatever small pieces of food they still had left. People tried to smile for the children, but the worry in their eyes was impossible to hide. The adults whispered about finding more food, searching for safer places to sleep, and how long their limited supplies would last. The children didn't understand everything, but they sensed something. Kids always do. The one who carried the notebook stayed quiet most of the time. He sat near the stream, writing about their situation. He wrote about how the group was getting weaker, how the food was almost gone, how the valley was both a blessing and a challenge. He wrote because he felt their pain should not disappear, even if no one else cared. Documenting their struggles gave him strength. It reminded him that their story mattered. Soon, the group divided into small teams to explore the valley. They searched for hidden food sources, for wild fruits, for anything that could help them survive. Each time a group left to explore, the others waited anxiously for their return. The land was new to them, and danger could hide anywhere sharp. Rocks, sudden drops, wild animals. They didn't know what lived here. They only knew they couldn't stay hungry. One team returned with some edible roots they found near a cluster of dry bushes. It wasn't much, but it was something. The group boiled the roots in a metal pot someone had carried from the homeland. The food tasted bland, even bitter, but no one complained. Hunger makes even the simplest food feel precious. Days passed, and still the valley revealed very little. The more they explored, the more they understood that the land had been abandoned. For a long time, there were signs of old fire circles of blackened stones, burnt logs, but they were so old that no one could guess who had lived here before. Some wondered whether another group had once been exiled here too. Maybe those people had moved on. Maybe they hadn't survived. The thought scared them. Arguments began to appear among the adults. Hunger and exhaustion make people short-tempered. Some blamed the valley, saying it would never support life. Others argued that leaving was too dangerous. They had no idea what lay beyond. A few suggested going back to the homeland, even if it meant facing rejection again. But the majority refused that idea. They had been cast out once. They wouldn't crawl back. One night, a quiet argument broke out near the stream. Two men disagreed about whether the group should move deeper into the valley or climb out and find a new place. Their voices rose, attracting attention. The children stopped playing. The older women shook their heads, tired of hearing adults fight when energy should be saved for survival. The man with the notebook stepped between them. He didn't raise his voice. He just asked them why they were fighting when everyone was suffering the same way. His words reminded them that they weren't enemies. Hunger was the enemy. Fear was the enemy. Slowly, the argument faded and the group softened again. But the tension still hung in the air. People were stressed, scared of what the future held, unsure if they had made the right choice by staying. A few days later, something small but important happened. A young boy, no older than 10, found a spot near the end of the valley where the soil was softer and darker. He dug a little with his hands and felt moisture under the surface. When he called the adults, they gathered around the place, testing the soil themselves. It was damper than anywhere else they had seen. Moist soil meant one thing. Maybe they could grow something here. The discovery lifted their spirits slightly. Even though they had no seeds at the moment, the idea of farming gave them a sense of direction. If the land could be healed, maybe they could be healed too. They marked the spot carefully and decided to keep searching for seeds or wild plants that could be transplanted. Meanwhile, the older members of the group focused on creating simple shelters. Using rocks, fallen branches, and dry grasses, They built rough but usable structures to guard against wind and cold. The shelters weren't pretty, but when night came and the cold winds began howling through the valley, they became comfortable enough to sleep in. People huddled together for warmth, and for the first time since leaving their homeland, they slept without fear of being swept away by storms. Water remained a blessing, but also a risk. Animals came to drink from the same stream. Most were harmless, but they still had to be careful. One evening, they saw large hoofprints near the stream. Something big had visited during the night. No one wanted to find out what it was. They started taking turns, guarding the area while others slept. It was exhausting, but necessary. The days continued, filled with the same cycle, searching for food, caring for the children, repairing shelters, and trying to keep the group calm. They grew thinner, their clothes dirtier, their faces more tired. But something also began to change. The group grew closer, more united than before. They checked on one another, shared whatever little food they had, talked more often to lift each other's spirits. The hardships were breaking them physically, but binding them emotionally. One evening, the man with the notebook sat on a rock and watched the group move around. The children were skipping stones in the stream. The adults were preparing the roots. They had gathered. A small fire warmed the center of the camp. The valley air was cool, but it smelled fresh. It didn't smell like blame or judgment or rejection. It smelled like earth and wind, simple but honest things. He opened his notebook and wrote that even though they were suffering, something inside the group was growing stronger, something the homeland could never steal from them. Their unity, their willingness to care for each other, their ability to survive, even when the world forgot them. One night, near the edge of sleep, they heard an animal cry somewhere in the distance. It wasn't close, but it echoed through the valley. Some children sat up in fear. The older ones comforted them, whispering that they were safe, that the valley protected them. Their words weren't entirely true, but in that moment, comfort mattered more than accuracy. The next morning, they found fresh tracks near the bushes. Something had passed through again, but it hadn't come near the shelter area. Still, the group began to talk about ways to protect themselves, building simple fences, tying branches together to create barriers, and gathering stones that could be used as tools if needed. They weren't warriors, a desperation teaches people to adapt. Despite their struggles, small signs of hope continued to appear. One afternoon, a woman discovered a wild plant with tiny berries growing near a rocky slope. After checking that they were safe to eat, she brought them to the group. The berries were sour, but refreshing. It wasn't a feast, but it was a reminder that the valley still had secrets to offer. Some people even laughed softly as children, smeared the berry juice on their faces, and played. The group still had fears. They still worried about the future, about surviving, about whether this place would be enough. But they also understood something important. They were alive, and they were together. That was more than many others in their situation could say. At night, as the stars filled the sky and the valley settled into quiet darkness, the man with the notebook looked around at the sleeping group. He realized that even though their bodies were exhausted, their will to survive had not broken. The valley was harsh, but it was giving them one thing the homeland never did: freedom. And somewhere deep inside each of them, a quiet belief was forming. A belief that even though they had been cast out and forgotten, they were not defeated. They were only at the beginning of something new, something difficult but meaningful. The valley was testing them, shaping them, forcing them to grow stronger. Part 2 closed not with victory, but with determination. And sometimes determination is the first spark of a future that has not yet shown its full shape. Life in the valley was beginning to change, slowly but surely. The group had survived hunger, cold nights, and long days of walking. They had found water, discovered small patches of soil that could grow food, and learned how to protect themselves from wild animals. But survival alone wasn't enough anymore. People began to dream quietly about what could be built in this rough, forgotten place. The mornings became busier. Adults worked together, gathering more roots, collecting berries, and slowly exploring farther into the valley. Some climbed rocky slopes to scout for better land. Others stayed to make the small shelters stronger, using stones and sticks to create simple but safer homes. Every step forward, no matter how small, felt like victory. The children learned quickly, too. They helped carry small bundles of firewood, fetched water, and learned to spot edible plants. They laughed sometimes, even when the food was bland or the day was long. Their laughter reminded the adults that life could still be joyful, even in hardship. And in those moments, the adults smiled too, letting themselves forget, for a little while, the pain of being cast out. One day, a group exploring near the stream found a shallow cave in the side of a hill. It was small, dark, and dusty, but it offered shelter from the wind and rain. The adults decided it could be a storage space for food and tools. They cleaned it carefully, arranging roots, berries, and dried grasses inside. The cave became their first hidden treasure, a place where they could keep what little they had safe from animals and the weather. The man with the notebook observed everything. He watched as people began to plan, as ideas formed naturally out of necessity. He wrote about the sense of pride growing in the group, even small victories, finding edible roots, building a sturdy shelter, discovering the cave felt like milestones. He knew that someday this story would show that people could endure even when the world abandoned them. Food was still a constant worry, but the group was learning patience. They discovered wild herbs that could be cooked to add flavor to the plain roots. They collected small fruits and dried them for later use. Every day brought a new lesson in survival, and with each lesson came a little more confidence. People began to understand the rhythm of the valley, the places where water flowed underground, the rocks that hid small edible plants, the areas where animals were unlikely to wander. The valley, harsh as it was teaching them something no one in their homeland could: how to depend on each other completely. In the city they had been cast out from, relationships were often shallow, built on convenience or fear. Here, dependence was real. You could not survive alone. Everyone contributed in some way, whether by carrying water, cooking food, watching the children, or scouting the land. Slowly, people began to trust one another in a deeper way than ever before. But trust did not come easily. Early arguments and frustrations were still remembered, and sometimes tempers flared. One afternoon, a disagreement arose over whether a section of the valley was safe enough to explore. Voices were raised, hands gestured, and a few words were said that later caused guilt and quiet apologies. The man with the notebook sat nearby, watching, and later wrote about it. He wrote that even in conflict, there was growth. People were learning to listen, to compromise, and to care enough to argue for the safety of others. As the days passed, the group realized they needed more than just food and shelter. They needed work that gave purpose. So they began planting small seeds they had found, burying them carefully in the softer soil discovered earlier. It was slow work. Not every seed survived, and not every attempt produced food. But each small sprout brought excitement. People touched the leaves gently, almost as if they were holding fragile hope in their hands. Even the children joined in, patting the soil, watering the plants with water carried in small containers, and watching eagerly as tiny green shoots peeked through the dirt. The adults smiled as they noticed the children's joy. It reminded everyone that they were building more than survival. They were building life itself. The valley also began to show its dangers. One evening, a group Exploring further into the rocky hills, came across signs of a wild animal. Its tracks were deep, and its calls echoed through the valley at night. Everyone understood the risk, but they didn't panic. Instead, they made plans. They built barriers near the stream, set up simple alarms using sticks and stones, and decided to take turns standing watch during the night. Fear had not disappeared, but it had been tamed into vigilance. Even with the challenges, small moments of beauty appeared. After rain fell one morning, the valley smelled fresh and alive. Tiny flowers bloomed in the moist soil. Birds returned, cautiously at first, and began singing. The group marveled at these small miracles. For a moment, they forgot hunger and exhaustion, focusing instead on the simple, unremarkable wonders of life. Stories began to spread quietly within the group. People told of the hardships they had overcome, the long walks through barren land, the freezing nights, and the moments when hope seemed lost. These stories were told not as complaints, but as lessons. They reminded everyone how far they had come, and that they could face even greater challenges. Listening to the stories, the children began to understand that survival was not just about food and shelter, was about courage and patience. The man with the notebook continued to write every day. His notes were no longer only about struggle. They were also about growth, resilience, and the moments of kindness that held the group together. He wrote about the laughter of the children, the teamwork of adults, the small joys that appeared even when life seemed most difficult. He knew that someday, someone might read these words and understand that being cast out was not the end. It was the beginning of something new. One afternoon, a woman discovered a small patch of fruit-bearing bushes hidden behind rocks. She called the others, and soon the group was carefully picking the fruit. It wasn't much, but it added variety to their diet, and it gave them confidence that the valley could sustain them in ways they hadn't yet imagined. They began to map the valley mentally, marking places where water, plants, and shelter could be found. Knowledge, they realized, was as important as food or protection. The adults also began teaching the children practical skills. They showed them how to find safe plants, how to collect water from hidden streams, how to build simple shelters, and how to recognize danger. The children listened attentively, asking questions and trying out the skills themselves. Slowly, the group was becoming more capable. They were not just surviving, they were learning to thrive. The evenings were spent near the fire, with people talking softly about the day. They shared hopes, fears, and ideas. They discussed where to explore next, what seeds to plant, and how to protect the valley from possible threats. These conversations were filled with care and thoughtfulness. Even in hardship, they found ways to dream. And one night, as the stars filled the sky above the valley, the man with the notebook looked around and saw something remarkable. The group, once broken and afraid, was beginning to form a rhythm. People were helping one another naturally. The children were learning. The adults were planning. They were not just surviving the valley, they were becoming part of it. The valley had tested them with hunger, cold, fear, and uncertainty. But it had also offered them lessons, growth, and a chance to start something new. The group understood that the valley would not be easy, but for the first time in many months, they felt a quiet certainty. They had been cast out and forgotten. But here, they were remembered by each other and by the land itself, that by the end of this part of their journey, they were no longer just a group of exiles. They were a community, learning to live together, to depend on one another, and to create something lasting. The valley, harsh and unforgiving, had become their teacher, their protector, and their home. And in that realization, they felt a spark that would grow into something far greater in the days to come. Time passed in the valley, and the group began to notice that their lives were slowly changing. What had started as simple survival was now becoming something more. They were no longer just trying to eat, drink, and sleep. They were starting to plan for the future. They were beginning to shape the valley into a place where life could grow, not just continue. The first signs of real progress were small but important. The seeds they had planted were beginning to sprout. Tiny green shoots peeked out of the dry soil, fragile but alive. The group gathered around them, watering carefully, clearing weeds, and protecting the little plants from animals. Watching life emerge from the hard ground filled everyone with hope. It reminded them that even in the harshest conditions, growth was possible. People began working together in new ways. Some focused on building better shelters. Using stones, mud, and branches, they made structures that could protect them from storms. Others worked on finding more food. They explored further, discovering hidden patches of berries, roots, and edible plants. Still others learned to store food and water safely, creating small places where their supplies could last longer. Each task, no matter how small, made life easier for everyone. The children were no longer just observers. They helped carry water, gather firewood, and assist in planting crops. They were learning valuable skills that would serve them for the rest of their lives. Their laughter and curiosity brought energy to the adults, reminding them that even in hard times, life could still be joyful. Watching the children grow and learn became one of the group's greatest sources of hope. Even as life improved, dangers still existed. Wild animals roamed the valley. One evening, fresh tracks appeared near the shelters. The adults quickly built simple barriers and took turns keeping watch. Nights were still cold, and the wind could be harsh, but they had grown stronger and more prepared. Fear no longer controlled them. It was respected, understood, and managed. A particularly cold night brought the group together in a way that left a lasting impression. A sudden windstorm ripped through the valley, rattling their shelters and howling through the rocky slopes. Everyone huddled together, the children in the center, the adults protecting them as best they could. The man with the notebook held it tightly, not to write, but as a symbol of something constant in the chaos. By morning, the storm had passed. Nothing was lost, except fear and doubt that they might not survive. That night had taught them the strength that existed when they stayed united. With basic survival becoming more reliable, the group started thinking about comfort and organization. They arranged their shelters in small clusters, creating paths between them. They cleared areas for walking and small spaces for the children to play. They began to treat the valley as a real home, not just a place to survive. The man with the notebook watched all of this and wrote about the subtle but powerful changes happening. People were growing more confident, more skilled, and more connected to each other. One day, a group exploring the far side of the valley stumbled across another water source, a small spring hidden behind rocks. The adults carefully inspected it, and when they realized it was clean, they started digging small channels to bring water closer to the shelters. The children helped carry stones and dirt, laughing as water splashed. For the first time, everyone could drink freely without worrying about running out. The valley, which had seemed so harsh and unforgiving, was slowly providing for them. Food became more varied too. They found wild fruits, vegetables, and roots. They experimented with cooking methods, learning which plants were safe and how to make them taste better. Everyone took part, sharing ideas and recipes. Meals, once a stressful necessity, became moments of community. People talked, laughed, and shared stories while eating. The group's bond grew stronger with every shared meal. Even the nights began to feel safer. The adults took turns keeping watch, but now it was more routine and less fearful. Fires were kept in central areas, offering warmth and light. The children slept without worry, and the adults could finally rest deeply. knowing that their community was more secure than ever before. As the valley became more livable, the group began thinking beyond basic survival. They started planning for the long term. They cleared areas for more crops, experimented with storing food, and organized tasks among themselves. Each person contributed in the way they were strongest. Those skilled at building focused on shelters and protection. Those with knowledge of plants focused on finding food. Everyone had a role, and every role was valued. This work brought a new sense of pride. They were no longer just exiles surviving by chance. They were builders, organizers, farmers, and caretakers. The valley was shaping them as much as they were shaping it. They began to feel that, for the first time in their lives, they had control over their destiny. Small celebrations became part of their routine. When a crop finally grew strong enough to harvest, they gathered together, shared the food, and talked about what worked and what didn't. They laughed at mistakes and cheered for successes. The man with the notebook wrote about these moments with particular care. These were the times when life felt most human, most connected, and most worth living. Trust among the group deepened. Arguments still happened, but they were smaller, resolved quickly, and often ended with understanding. People had learned patience and compassion, realizing that everyone had weaknesses and fears. The valley had forced them to rely on one another, and in doing so, they had discovered resilience they never knew they had. One day, the man with the notebook suggested exploring a part of the valley that had been avoided because of steep slopes. A small group agreed to follow him. The climb was difficult, but when they reached the top, they were rewarded with a breathtaking view. The valley stretched out below them, larger and richer than they had realized. Streams wound through the land, patches of green were scattered everywhere, and the sun reflected off rocks and water in a way that made the place feel alive. Standing there, looking at the valley, they realized how far they had come. This was not just survival anymore. This was life. They had taken a land that seemed empty and harsh and were beginning to turn it into a home, a realm of their own. The view filled them with pride and hope. They laughed, hugged, and shared the moment. For the first time, they felt they could truly call this place theirs. Returning from the climb, the group started planning more seriously for the future. They organized areas for planting, building, and storage. They set up systems to gather water from the streams in spring. They made a simple schedule for daily tasks. Life was still hard, but it was predictable, and predictability allowed planning, and planning allowed dreams. The man with the notebook reflected on all of this. He wrote that even in exile, even in being forgotten, people had the power to create something new. The valley had tested them, but it had also given them a second chance. They were not victims of circumstance anymore. They were builders of a future that belonged entirely to them. Night in the valley had changed too. Fires were no longer just for warmth. They were central gathering points. People sat around the flames, sharing stories, singing quietly, and talking about the day. Children learned by listening, absorbing the lessons of survival, teamwork, and hope. Adults felt a sense of calm, knowing that their efforts were not wasted. Slowly, the valley became not just a place to survive, but a place to live fully. Even challenges continued. The valley could still be harsh. Storms arrived unexpectedly. Animals wandered close to shelters, and food supplies sometimes ran low. But the group was prepared now. They had learned from mistakes, built defenses, and developed routines. Challenges were no longer threats. They were tests they were ready to face together. One day, the group noticed travelers from outside the valley. People they didn't know, passing through, stopped to look at the valley. They were surprised to see a thriving settlement in a place most would have assumed uninhabitable. The exiled group welcomed them, shared their water, and even gave some food. The travelers were amazed at what they saw. Word began to spread quietly about the group that had been cast out but had survived, adapted, and built a new home. The realization that their story was spreading brought a sense of pride. They had been forgotten, dismissed, and treated as failures. Now they were living proof that resilience, unity, and determination could overcome even the harshest challenges. They were no longer simply survivors. They were a model of what could be achieved when people cared for each other and refused to give up. By the end of this part of their journey, the group had transformed. The valley, once rough and barren, had become alive with shelters, plants, running water, and the laughter of children. They were not only surviving, they were thriving. They had learned to work together, trust each other, and create a community. Their exile had given them something unexpected, the chance to rise stronger than they ever imagined. And in the quiet moments, as the sun set over the valley, the man with the notebook wrote, "From the ashes of rejection and pain, they had built something that could not be destroyed. They had built life itself." By the time the group had spent months in the valley, it had transformed from a harsh, empty place into a home full of life. Shelters had been reinforced with stones and mud. Small gardens were growing healthy plants, and the children laughed and played freely. Even the wind, once harsh and cold, now felt less threatening. The valley was no longer just a place to survive. It had become a place where life could flourish, where hope could grow, and where the people could finally feel safe. The group had changed too. They had grown stronger, wiser, and more confident. The hardships that once seemed unbearable had taught them patience, endurance, and unity. People no longer blamed the world for their suffering. Instead, they focused on what they could do with what they had. They had learned to rely on each other fully, and the bonds between them were unbreakable. They were not just a group of exiles anymore. They were a community, a new family formed from shared struggle and shared triumph. News of their survival had begun to spread. Travelers passing through the region brought stories of the thriving settlement hidden in the valley. Some said they had seen homes made of stone and mud, gardens growing with vegetables and fruit, and people who worked together with skill and harmony. The story reached their old homeland, which had once cast them out. Those who had dismissed them as failures now whispered in surprise, wondering how a forgotten group had not only survived, but flourished. One day, a small group from the homeland came to the edge of the valley. They stood silently, watching the settlement from a distance, unsure whether to approach. The exiled group noticed them, but instead of fear or anger, they felt a quiet dignity. They had no need to fight or defend themselves. They had built a life with their own hands, and nothing the homeland could say or do would take that away. The travelers were hesitant at first. They had expected to find weak, desperate people, but instead they saw confident adults teaching children, people tending gardens, and families working together. It was clear that this community had found strength in ways the homeland could not understand. The exiles welcomed them cautiously, offering water and food. They did not demand respect, but their quiet confidence made it impossible for anyone to doubt their worth. This encounter reminded the group how far they had come. They had been rejected, cast out, and forgotten, but none of that mattered anymore. They had created something the homeland could never take away, a life built on resilience, unity, and hope. The valley had taught them that survival was not enough. True strength came from creating, nurturing, and protecting life together. As the days passed, the group continued to expand their settlement. More areas were cleared for gardens, storage shelters were improved, and small paths were built to connect different parts of the valley. The children learned more skills: how to plant seeds, carry water efficiently, identify edible plants, and even basic first aid. Every member of the community had a role, and everyone's contribution was valued equally. Even the elders, who had once feared the unknown, began to feel pride. They taught lessons to the younger ones, shared stories of the past, and offered wisdom for solving problems. Their guidance helped the group plan for the future, making sure that each day's work built towards something lasting. The valley, once a symbol of exile and hardship, had become a teacher, a protector, and a partner in shaping the lives of everyone who lived there. One afternoon, the group gathered at the top of a small hill to celebrate a successful harvest. Tiny vegetables and fruits had grown from the seeds planted months earlier, and the sight of green plants thriving in the soil filled everyone with joy. They laughed, shared food, and spoke of the plans for the next planting season. It was a celebration of more than just crops. It was a celebration of life, determination, and the power of community. The man with the notebook watched quietly, writing down every detail. He knew that someday someone would read these words and understand the journey of people who had been cast out and forgotten. He wrote about the courage it took to keep moving, the patience required to plant and nurture life, and the trust that had grown between them. He wrote about small moments, a child learning to carry water, a woman discovering new berries, the laughter that rang out across the valley. Each moment was a victory, each lesson a treasure. Even with their progress, challenges remained. Storms would still hit unexpectedly, animals could threaten crops, and there were times when food ran low. But the group had learned that challenges were not obstacles. They were opportunities to grow stronger and work together. Each problem brought the community closer, teaching them skills and lessons that ensured their survival and the survival of future generations. The valley itself seemed to respond to their efforts. The soil grew richer, water flowed more steadily, and wildlife returned. Birds nested near the stream, small animals appeared near the shelters, and the air felt alive with the sounds of life. The group worked carefully to coexist with the animals, learning when to protect their crops and when to let nature take its course. They had learned that survival meant harmony, not domination. Over time, the community began thinking beyond just survival and comfort. They started to plan for the long term. They built storage areas to keep seeds safe, reinforced shelters to withstand harsh weather, and began teaching the next generation the skills they would need to thrive. Leadership had grown naturally among the group, not through titles, but through the respect people earned by their actions. Decisions were made collectively, with input from everyone, ensuring that each member had a voice in shaping their shared future. One day, the group spotted travelers passing nearby. These were not from their homeland, but from distant regions. Curiosity and caution guided their approach. The travelers were amazed to see the settlement thriving in a place that seemed so harsh from afar. They asked questions, and the exiled group shared knowledge about growing crops, finding water, and working together. The visitors left with admiration, carrying stories of the thriving community back to their own regions. Slowly, the reputation of the valley's inhabitants began to spread far and wide. The group understood the significance of this. They had been cast out and forgotten, but their actions and their lives were changing how others saw them. They no longer depended on the approval of their former homeland or outsiders. They had earned respect through hard work, perseverance, and care for one another. They realized that their exile had been a hidden gift. It had forced them to create something meaningful and strong. As the seasons changed, the valley transformed with them. Gardens flourished, small paths connected homes and work areas, and the children grew strong and capable. People celebrated each small victory, from a successful harvest to a new shelter, or even the discovery of a hidden water source. Each success built confidence and pride. The community had learned that even the smallest achievements mattered when building a future from nothing. Evenings were filled with quiet reflection and storytelling. Around fires, people shared memories of the past, the exile, the long journey, and the struggles they had overcome. But these stories were no longer sad tales of rejection. They were lessons of courage, hope, and unity. The children listened, absorbing the lessons and understanding that they were part of something greater than themselves. The past no longer held power over them. It had become a foundation on which to build a new life. The man with the notebook continued to write, capturing the evolution of the community. He wrote about laughter, shared meals, teamwork, and the quiet determination that had transformed the valley. He wrote about storms weathered, crops nurtured, and the growing sense of pride in each person. He wrote because he wanted the story to live on, not as a tale of exile and suffering, but as a testament to human resilience and the ability to rise from the ashes. One morning, the group decided to explore beyond the valley to see if there were other places that could support life. They discovered fertile land nearby, a small forest, and another hidden spring. Excitement filled the group as they realized the valley could grow into more than a home. It could become a thriving settlement. They returned to share the news, and the community celebrated the possibilities that lay ahead. Even as the settlement expanded, the group remained humble and united. They had learned that life was fragile, that survival was not guaranteed, and that working together was the key to overcoming adversity. They celebrated successes, supported one another in struggles, and planned carefully for the future. The valley had taught them that resilience was not just enduring hardships, but learning, adapting, and growing stronger with each challenge not in time. The valley became more than a home. It became a symbol of what people could achieve when they refused to give up, when they relied on one another, and when they believed in the possibility of a better future. The exiles who had once been forgotten were no longer invisible. They had created a life full of hope, strength, and purpose. They had transformed hardship into opportunity, pain into growth, and exile into triumph. And as the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in warm colors, the man with the notebook looked around at the community he had witnessed grow. Children laughed as they played, adults worked together in harmony, and the valley itself seemed alive with energy. He wrote the final words of his cur.